Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of On the Mark TV and radio here on Westville Community Programming Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach, and today we're getting a chance to talk with a New York Times best-selling author who started out in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. He grew up around the corner from me, but we didn't know each other as kids. Michael Tougias, who's got a new book out called In the Waters Between Us. It is rising up on the charts of the bestseller list, and it's great to have you on board this morning.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
Yeah. So I'm really curious how somebody from Longmeadow got to be a best-selling author.
By accident. I was a business major. I didn't start writing until I was 30. And my earlier books focused on the outdoors. One was Quabbin, A History and Explorer's Guide. So there were regional books, and then later I switched to true survival at sea stories. 10 Hours Until Dawn occurred during the blizzard of 1978, and that became a bestseller. So that kind of launched my career in a different direction.
And the current book, what prompted you to write that, and how? I know that people are talking about it all over the place. The response to it's been pretty cool.
Well, The Waters Between Us was an idea that had been kicking around in my head for many years about writing about growing up in Western Mass in the 1960s and 70s. But I also wanted to include the relationship with my dad and how that changed over time. So it was a challenging book to write in that basically the first half of the book is all these misadventures out in the woods or the water, some on the Connecticut River that are kind of laugh out loud funny. And then the book takes a more serious twist a little after the halfway mark, getting into some things that happened to my family, some changes that I went through. So I tried to be brutally honest in this book, and that's why people say, "Boy, The Waters Between Us." I was laughing, and I didn't see what was coming later in the book, because again, it's like two stories in one.
How did your family react to them being the subject of a book?
Well, my father passed away, and I would not have written this book while he was alive because he would not have wanted any attention on some of the remarkable things he did actually when a tragedy hit our family. And other family members, it's been positive, but I haven't heard from everybody, again, because I've been so honest in the books. I'm wondering if some people maybe weren't that thrilled with it.
You've written like over 30 books at this point. How many are you working on now? Do you work one book at a time, or do you have multiple ones in progress?
I recommend for writers to do one at a time, but I don't follow my own recommendation. So I usually have at least a couple going at the same time. I'd prefer one at a time because your focus is so much better. But oftentimes, because of contract situations and deadlines, you're juggling a couple different ones.
And I would assume that you have to spend a lot of time as an author promoting your books, book tours, interviews, and all of that to make sure that they climb the bestseller list.
Exactly. Unless you're Stephen King, you have to get out there. And when I do, every now and then I'll teach a course called Get Published. When I talk to aspiring writers, I say, be prepared to do a lot of legwork when the book is released. Otherwise, it just gets lost in the shuffle of thousands of books being released that month.
Yeah, I noticed that. I mean, one of the big tools that authors used or used to use was book tours, and they'd go out and they'd, in theater terms, they'd say they played the Palace. In this case, they're playing the Barnes and Noble and the independent booksellers around and about. But the pandemic sort of stopped that. So how are you getting the word out about your book when you can't really go out there and hand it out to people?
Via Zoom presentations and also the old-fashioned way through newspapers, which have been fantastic. They've been so good to me over the years, probably because I used to write for so many as a freelancer. So, that combination and radio, of course, where you don't have to always be there in person. So it's all been a big help. And then the organic way of having people spread the word if they like the book themselves. And a lot of people do that because they've known me over the years. And if they're from Western Massachusetts, they're telling other people from Western Mass, hey, this book, has a lot of places that you'll remember. And people of a certain age, and my age, I'm in 66, who grew up in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of them are writing to me and saying, boy, it brought back memories. Some of your experiences were similar to my own. And some of the family dynamics between you and your dad were similar to my own as well.
Yeah, I mean, anytime I read a book written by somebody from Longmeadow, it doesn't make a difference the time where the book is set. It brings me back to my childhood. And every so often, I drive down the street I grew up on. And I'm surprised that in some ways, Longmeadow has never changed, and the memories of growing up there are still very strong. But then I notice what house got painted a different color, or what house got damaged by a storm, and things like that. Do you come back to Longmeadow and kind of relive your childhood at any given point?
I do occasionally, and usually when I go back to a place I haven't seen in a long time or knew well as a child, everything looks a little smaller. Even the yard on the house I grew up with, it's like, wow, I remembered it as so much bigger. The one place that never changed, though, which is really nice, is what we call the Meadows, the Fanny Stebbins Wildlife Sanctuary. And that's where the Waters Between Us opens up with a chapter. I'm down there at age, let's see, what was I, 11, and my brother's 10, and my father, who was a baker, drops us off at 5 in the morning, and it's still dark. We were going to go fishing, so we don't know what to do, so we sit by the side of the road because it's too dark, and we eat our lunch.
I don't know if you remember growing up. I used to go to the river a lot too. My father taught me to drive on the road going from Emerson Road and the railway tracks down to the town dump.
Yes.
But I remember growing up, and there was a sandbar in the river that we used to wade to on the low tide, and it was forbidden. The cops would come down there and drag you off the sandbar and call your parents to come get you. And now that I'm an adult and walk down there every so often, that sandbar has trees that are 30 and 40 feet tall on it. It's a little forest on the river, and I guess the high school kids still use it as a party point. But I notice when I'm down there the changes from childhood to the present. And the best way to view it is on the train from Springfield going south, and you sit there, gaze out the window at that whole area that we grew up hanging out at.
Yep, you see it all. The memories come flooding back. But I feel, very lucky that growing up in the 60s and 70s, there were still so much woods. Now a lot of the developments have sprung up there, but we could go out our back door and find adventure. And, that's a theme of the book, is trying to find adventure led me to misadventures. One was life-threatening, but others are just funny.
Yeah, you write in a variety of genres. Does any particular genre appeal to you most, or do you like switching it up?
I switch it up depending on what my passion is. For example, history's always been important to me. So I co-wrote a book on King Philip's Indian War, and then a more recent book co-written about the first U-boats that came right to the Mississippi River, right to the mouth. And the ones for me that have sold the best have been these true survival stories at sea, such as A Storm Too Soon and The Finest Hours. But no, to answer your question, there's not one particular one I like better than others. I'm even finding I like, and I've been doing this lately, is middle reader books, so age 8 to 14. And I have a series with Macmillan called the True Rescue series. So they're adaptations of the adult adventure books for kids, and I'm really enjoying that as well. I'd like to do more fiction in the future, but it's a different ball game, so we'll see.
And how long does a book sit in your head before it goes to paper?
From start to finish, when I start to buckle down, I'd say about 18 months, 6 months, you're doing a lot of research and a lot of reading. Then I start the writing while I'm still doing some research and continue that on. Then you're going through the revisions. So I'd say 18 months. Obviously you're doing other things as well, doing some speaking at libraries and to private groups. But so 18 months is it. Whereas the waters between us, that I'd been chipping away at for about 15 years, trying to refine some of the central themes in it and which incidents in my teenage years and into my early 20s did I want to include. They had to pass kind of a test for me. Are they either laugh out loud funny, or are they tugging at your heartstrings, really memorable moments to me that I remember like they happened yesterday.
But though as you're working on it and the year goes by or the 18 months, does your perspective on what you're writing change?
I would say it depends on the story and new material you might uncover. Um, by and large, not too much. Once you get those first couple of chapters going, then to me, it always becomes clear after 2 or 3 chapters exactly how I want this to go. But every now and then, something you either forgot, if it's a memoir or a new piece of information for history, will put the book in a little bit different direction.
Do you write longhand on a pad or do you write on a computer or do you use something like speak text to get your words down on paper? What works for you?
All on the computer with Word. That I find is the best. I marvel at the people who can do it all in longhand and then transfer it over. But I make too many revisions, and it's so easy to do with the computer. So I don't know how Thoreau did it back in his day, and not back things up either.
Yeah, I can't figure out how I could write any of the things I need to write without a computer that had spell check and things like that. And a couple of years ago, I was in an accident, was flat on my back, and I found that I couldn't sit up long enough to type, but I
Mhm.
discovered speak text, which is really wonderful until it misinterprets what you say. And using speak text and to go back and edit it took longer than it did to actually try to type it.
Right. And I sometimes think I think through my fingertips. And it just seems that way because I don't do as good a job trying to write it in longhand, or I have tried speaking platforms to record it, and that doesn't work well for me either.
Yeah. Do you devote a certain time every day to write, or do you write when you have the time?
Most authors who I've gotten to know do have a set pattern, and it's usually get up early, get that cup of coffee going, and write in the mornings. I have no pattern whatsoever. I go in spurts. Oftentimes, if that deadline is looming for the book contract, then I really go into lockdown mode. And then other times, I might not write a word for a couple of months. I should have a writing schedule, but it seems to work for me not having one.
You've won several awards for your writing over the years. Is there one that you're most proud of?
I think the best nature book of the year from the independent publishers for There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. It was a book I wrote about my cabin in Vermont. And at age 22, I thought I was this mountain man up there, and I had a lot to learn. And So they appreciated that the nature part of it is kind of subtly woven in. As you can tell from the title, there's a porcupine in my outhouse. But what I was trying to do was tell, again, a personal story, much like The Waters Between Us. And as it turned out, Porcupine in the Outhouse works kind of as a sequel to The Waters Between Us, because it picks up when the day I bought the cabin, and that's how The Waters Between Us ends.
Okay,
so they kind of go together.
Yeah, we're going to take a very short break here to acknowledge the underwriters that make programming like this possible on Westfield Community Programming Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. We're talking with the best-selling author Michael Tougias, who grew up in Long Meadow. We'll be back to chat more with him after a couple of underwriting announcements, so don't go away.
Underwriting is brought to you by Boise Cascade Distribution, providing products and services needed for building material dealers, home improvement centers, and industrial customers. They offer everything from engineered wood and plywood to Drex decking and railing, James Hardie siding, and Advantech subfloor. Located at 33 Fowler Street Extension in Westfield and on the web at bc.com, they are committed to providing quality products, great service, convenience, and value.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Dunkin' Donut Shops of Westfield and the Sardinia family. It's nice to know that even as the world changes, Dunkin' Coffee remains the same at 7 convenient locations throughout Westfield.
Underwriting for Community Radio on WSKB is brought to you in part by Rockies. Over 30 convenient locations throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Florida. One of the nation's largest ACE dealers. Expertise and great product selection in paint, hardware, lawn and garden. That's Rockies. Rock solid service since 1926. On the web at rockies.com.
Hi, this is Harry Rock, host of Rock on Westfield every fourth Wednesday at 8 a.m. Tune in for my view of this place I call home.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM, WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles is our chief engineer this morning. We're broadcasting from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy. My guest via Zoom is Michael Tougias, the author. Before we went to the break, we were talking about some of the works that you've done, and one of your books got turned into a movie with Chris Pine and Casey Affleck. What was it like seeing your book adapted for film, and were you involved in the adaptation?
Mark, it was a wonderful experience, and I learned quickly to just let go, that once you sign the rights to Disney, they're going to do their thing, and I was very lucky there were 2 great producers. So being on the set from time to time was fascinating, because they filmed a lot of the finest hours in a giant warehouse in Quincy, Mass., the old Four River shipyard, and they actually rebuilt a half of an oil tanker to scale, full-scale oil tanker in a giant swimming pool to recreate this rescue. And the rescue happened off Cape Cod in 1952 when 2 oil tankers split in half on the same day in a winter storm. Huh. So I felt really blessed.
Were you the adapter for the film, or did they just buy the rights and have somebody else adapt it?
Yeah, they had 2 very experienced screenwriters do the screenplay, but they would keep me in the loop and call me from time to time and ask questions. And I only wrote 1 scene in the book. It involves Bernie Weber, the hero, his fiance. I wrote that scene, but they bring in people who are way more experienced, because I've never done screenplays. It's a whole different type of writing. So the whole experience was wonderful, and they did capture the essence of this reluctant hero. He thought he was being sent out on a suicide mission.
Were you surprised, or did it impact you in some way seeing the final product as it was on screen? Did you when you write your books, do you ever envision the idea that they might transfer to another medium?
Every author dreams of it, but the stars have to align perfectly. I remember the very first screening, I couldn't help but think of, oh, I would have done this scene that way, that scene this way. And then the second time at the premiere in Hollywood, I just let go. I was with my kids and I got a big thing of popcorn and I loved it. So I detached as the author and just enjoyed their creative process. So it was a very different experience once I learned to do that.
Is that the only one of your books that's been recreated for film?
Yes. Another one that has a good chance is So Close to Home about the U-boat. It sinks a ship off the Mississippi River mouth, and there's a family on 4 on board. So it has that aspect of a family survival story, and you really don't see that with an American family in World War II. All the World War II movies and books take place overseas. So that one has a shot.
Yeah. Are you working, now that you've got the book out about the family, have other books in the pipeline at this point?
Yep, I'm doing another book for that kids series, which I enjoy doing. And then I did a work of fiction for kids. It's called Claws. It's going to be kind of a scary book for middle readers. And that's finished. So that's in the publisher's pipeline to come out in, September.
Okay. When you write for kids or younger audiences, what's the difference writing for them versus a general adult readership?
Get to the heart of the story much quicker. My mantra for adult books is make it fast paced, and for kids books, my mantra is make it faster paced. And so a little bit shorter sentences, a little less background detail, again, to move that story faster and to hook them a little quicker.
And what kind of response do you get from when you're writing for younger audiences? Do you get feedback from the kids that are reading it?
I do. I get emails, and the ones I like the best are they'll use a term such as they call me a reluctant reader, and I don't read very much, but I stayed up for 2 nights and finished A Storm Too Soon. That's one that there's a title of the same name for adult and for the kids book has the same title. And I write back and I go, thank you so much, because that's exactly what I was trying to do. Make this for the kids who may not be big readers and get you right into this true adventure.
Do you think that more people have taken up reading during the pandemic because they've been stuck at home? Are you finding people that you're running into that are reading your book because they can't go to the movies, they can't go to the theater, they can't go to restaurants?
Anecdotally, I've heard that people are reading more, but I don't know the numbers for sure. It sure makes sense that, TV was a bunch of reruns, and I don't really watch TV myself, so I'm reading a book a week and love it. And if the book I'm reading doesn't pull me in the first 2 chapters, I move on myself. There's just so many good books. So, for example, I wrote a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's about a pilot who was killed during his reconnaissance mission. But I open up with a near miss of another pilot where a surface-to-air missile almost brings him down, again, to hook the reader early on.
Were there any authors early on that influenced you or that you read either as a kid or in college? You said, if I write, I want to emulate that level of writing?
There were a whole bunch, like even Farley Moat, it just popped into my head. He had a bunch of adventure books set in the far north, up in northern Canada. And so at the younger age, I wasn't the best student, but I was a big reader, and they were the same kind of books I'm writing. And then later in life, with Porcupine in the Outhouse and The Waters Between Us, I always loved Bill Bryson's writing, particularly A Walk in the Woods, because you had that laugh out loud funny parts. And then more recently, Maya Angelou's, I was reading her autobiography when I was writing The Waters Between Us to see if some of that great writing and honesty could rub off on me.
We only have a minute or so left. So if people want to learn more about you or learn more about your books, do you have a website or a social media presence?
Yeah, I do. I have a great website that Allison, my fiance, made for me. And it's michaeltougias.com, Tougias. And on there are some videos of the rescues. One is mind-blowing, 80-foot waves. But also, listeners can order The Waters Between Us or Quabbin. Quabbin, by the way, is out of print, but I have copies, cases. I saw on Amazon that used copies are selling for $57.
Wow. You
can buy a new one from me for $18.95. But and there's a way when you order, it's a little box that asks how you want me to inscribe it. So if you're going to give it as a gift for Father's Day, I can sign it to that person with an inscription. So the website was a big hit. It's been fantastic in a way, even for some of these out of print books to come back and be out there again, because I always order a whole bunch of cases and my garage is full. so there's plenty of books out there.
Well, I really want to thank you for joining us today. And it's always a great opportunity for folks to learn about the authors who got their start in Western Massachusetts. And I'm really thrilled to get a chance to talk with somebody who got their start around the corner. So, Michael, thanks for joining us. We've been chatting with the author, Michael Tougias. We're going to take a break to acknowledge our underwriters, so we'll be back with more On the Mark, so don't go away.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by Westfield Bank. For more than 160 years, Westfield Bank has been an important community presence and commercial leader in the Pioneer Valley. With convenient full banking services in Westfield, West Springfield, East Longmeadow, Agawam, Feeding Hills, Springfield, Southwick, as well as Enfield and Granby, Connecticut, visit us on the web at westfieldbank.org.
Support for community radio on WSKB is provided by Betts Plumbing and Heating Supply Company, an independent, family-owned wholesaler serving Westfield for over 50 years, specializing in plumbing, heating, and industrial piping supplies. On the web at bettsplumbing.com or at 14 Coleman Avenue in Westfield.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by Bay State Dental. Comprehensive dentistry at 14 convenient locations in Springfield, Chicopee, Longmeadow, West Springfield, Belchertown, East Longmeadow, Ludlow, Northampton, Greenfield, and Wilbraham, as well as 29 Broad Street in Westfield. Bay State Dental makes it a priority to help you achieve and maintain the healthy smile you deserve. On the web at baystatedental.com.
This is Ken Stomsky from Ken's Den on WCPC 15 and 89.5 FM, Tuesdays, 8 to 10.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM, WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles is our chief engineer this morning. If you've missed a part of today's program, or you want to catch some of the other On the Mark or Art Speed programs that we do here, you can find them on YouTube on WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. Our guest this half hour is Glenn Perry. He's been a professional astrologer since 1975. He's a licensed psychotherapist in private practice, author of 8 books on astrology, and I have to admit in transparency, we went to the same high school and graduated the same year. Good morning, Glenn.
Good morning, Mark.
It's
nice
great
to see you
have you
again.
here. I've never chatted with an astrologer or an astrology expert before, but I know that the professionals in the field like yourself are much different than the ones that you read when you stand at the supermarket checkout line and it says your Cancer horoscope for the month of April or stuff like that. How did you get into astrology, and how did you bring your technique and training to the level it's at now?
Well, big question. It's sort of interesting because I actually got started in one of those supermarket checkout lines. I remember there was a book by Sidney Omar, who was a very popular astrologer back in the 1960s. And he had a sort of a astrological analysis of the major traits of each sun sign. And I picked up my little book on Cancer, and I think I was about 16 at the time, and I was kind of blown away at how accurate it was. I hadn't read anything or ever even heard anybody describe me so precisely and clearly. So, at that age, you're kind of trying to figure out who you are anyway. So it's a bit of a revelation. And it was always in the back of my mind, and I always kind of flirted with it and studied a little bit when I had a chance. Of course, I was in high school and then prep school and then college. And it wasn't really until 72 when I got out after I got my Bachelor's of Science degree that I had a chance to really dig into it. And so I did. And the more I learned about it, the more blown away I was at how useful and valid it was. And I was kind of astonished that it wasn't more widely accepted and utilized, especially in the helping professions. So I just kept studying it, and a couple of years after that, decided to go back to graduate school. I got my master's and then my doctorate in psychology. But I was always integrating what I was learning in psychology with what I had already known and was utilizing professionally in my work as an astrologer. So pretty much from the start, I was blending the two fields.
Where does astrology actually come from? I mean, you see the supermarket tabloids with horoscopes and things, but it's an art and a science. It really has a long tradition, long before the present.
Yeah, I mean, really nobody knows where it began. It's somewhat of an arbitrary point as to say what the beginning was. In a lot of ways, it was the first religion, the first essentially pagan religion, where primitive humans were trying to make sense out of events on Earth, particularly the changing of the seasons. And, the various events that would happen, when strawberries would get ripe and caribou would migrate, and when the weather was going to get cold, and when agriculture started back in around 10,000, 12,000 BC, knowing the proper time to plant and harvest and so forth was critically important. So as far as we know, pre-literate humans were always looking at the stars and the planets, the wandering stars they called them, because they had no way of differentiating what was a star from what was a planet. But they were particularly interested in the cycles of the sun and moon, because they would move through groups of stars which came to be known as constellations, and were kind of like a giant calendar clock in the sky. So initially it was very practical, but these cyclic movements in the various stages of the annual cycle ultimately came to be associated not only with geophysical changes, but also with social political changes. And then from there, around 500 BC, it became much more sophisticated as the astronomy kept improving. And for the first time, they began to develop or produce actual astrological charts. That became more sophisticated around the 1st century BC, and that was the advent of what was called Hellenistic astrology. And that was the first astrology that was more or less utilizing the same variables that we do today, albeit in a very different way.
So there is a science to it, and why are people suspicious of it? A lot of people think, oh, that's hogwash, or nobody could really predict something from astrology. How did it get that reputation? Because it really is very finite.
Well, I just started to say a little bit about Hellenistic astrology. Back 2,000 years ago, when horoscopic astrology was really starting to roll, the worldview at the time was very fatalistic, very deterministic. They had figured out that the planetary cycles can be calculated right down to the day and hour, and that seasonal changes and other kinds of changes on Earth and in people's lives seem to correlate to these planetary movements. And so they concluded that the planets were the visible representative of gods, that they were associated with gods, and that these godly decrees were determinate. In other words, they were sort of like top-down, unidirectional, from above to below, and that life on Earth was determined and thus fated by these external heavenly powers. Now, at that time, it wasn't such a radical idea to say that, but by the time we got into the scientific revolution, toward the 16th, 17th century, and human beings were trying to gain control over nature, utilizing the experimental method and whatnot, the idea that we were not free, that we were determined and fated by powers external to human consciousness was disturbing. It seemed to fly in the face of the zeitgeist of the time. And that's been true pretty much ever since, even more so, because as evolution proceeds, people become more conscious, more self-aware. They have a greater sense of self-agency, more sense of internal freedom, an ability to make their lives and who they are by virtue of what they will. And so the idea that there's this model that is deterministic and fatalistic really contradicts the sort of evolutionary thrust of consciousness evolution. So it's incompatible with how we conceive of ourselves. At least the old way of thinking about astrology is incompatible with the way we think about ourselves today. But that's not how astrology is used anymore, at least by people like myself that apply it in a psychological sense.
I was going to say, what are the applications for it in today's world? Why would an individual, or what would they gain from learning more about it? And can they change their life or their course of direction because of it? Or do they just realize the path that they're destined to follow?
Well, both, really. I mean, it's a much more subtle, nuanced understanding than existed 2,000 years ago. And there's even controversy in the field of astrology today. There's a lot of people that are sort of re-embracing the old Hellenistic model, and then they're sort of at war with the more psychological camp. Because the psychological camp, the way that I do astrology, and the kind of astrology that's really, I think, gained increasing precedence or primacy, I might say, since the 1960s, is this psychological version of astrology. And it's the idea that the chart can be utilized to understand the internal workings of the psyche. It's like a snapshot or a map of the psychodynamics of the person. Literally, you can sort of get a sense of what's going on psychologically within the person. Each variable in the chart represents something psychological. For example, all the 12 signs represent basic psychological drives or needs. Then they have planetary representatives that represent psychological functions, kind of analogous to the way we have physiological organs like a heart and a liver and a kidney, and they perform their functions within on the physiological plane. On the psychological or the psychospiritual plane, planets perform similar kinds of functions. They represent ways of being, certain classes of actions. And at the same time, they have relations. They form angular relationships to one another. So you have a whole structure of the psyche that is dynamic and and alive as we are, it's not determinate in the sense that it represents something above that's causing us to behave and think and feel the way we do. It operates more on what's called the principle of synchronicity, the idea that what's within and what's without are acausally related. There's a coincidence of meaning between above and below, between within and without. But consciousness is primary, so that when a person is born and they have a particular chart, that chart does represent a fate of sorts, but it also represents a trajectory of psychospiritual development. And the variables in the chart can be increasingly integrated and their potentials actualized in accord with the development, the learning, the psychological growth, the healing, the process of self-actualization, choose your terminology, that is consistent with the way modern psychology conceives of the individual. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's the least deterministic psychological model that exists. The most psychological theories, to one degree or another, still being sort of born out of the mechanistic paradigm of the Enlightenment, are somewhat deterministic, but astrology is not. And in that sense, it's unique.
Yeah. I know that you teach a lot of courses in this field and have your own program. How many professional astrologers are there? Is it a unique industry, or are there many? And are there any levels that one has to go through to be certified to utilize astrology in psychology, for example?
Well, there's diploma programs and certification programs and various astrological organizations that require a certain level of training before you can become certified by that astrological organization. And that's increased over the decades, again, since I'd say the mid 20th century. But the two fields are relatively separate from one another, that being astrology and psychology. There are an increasing number, it's an incalculable number. I can't, I would just be guessing how many psychotherapists are utilizing astrology as a diagnostic and prognostic tool, or as a developmental model, or as a personality theory. There are many, like myself. I mean, I suppose many is a somewhat arbitrary term, but increasingly, I would say it's gaining popularity because I have a lot of psychotherapists that are coming into my school and wanting to learn the model that I teach. And there's lots of others that are out there doing psychologically oriented or astrologically enhanced psychotherapy is what I call it. But again, I can't give you a number. There's a lot of astrologers that have a psychological orientation, but generally speaking, they don't do ongoing counseling.
Okay.
Usually they do what's called consultations, and it's 1 or 2 sessions.
Yeah. If somebody wanted to talk with a counselor who dealt with astrology, where do they find somebody? I mean, if you do you look on LinkedIn? Do you look, how do you find somebody who does
you
what
can
you do?
look, yeah, you can look on LinkedIn, but it's probably more effective just to do a search. You type in astrology with psychotherapy, or astrotherapy, or psychology and astrology, although that's going to get you a lot of links of people that are not necessarily psychotherapists. The best search term would be psychotherapy, astrology with psychotherapy.
Now, are there lots of people that are qualified to do this around the country? I know that you attend conferences and seminars and things. Are you meeting a lot of people that are qualified and certified to do this, so that if somebody's doing a search, they can find them?
Are you talking about certified astrologers, or astrologers that are certified to utilize astrology in their practices?
The latter.
Yeah, there's none. And the reason for that is that psychotherapy, the field of psychotherapy, does not certify astrologers. There's no training in the field of psychotherapy that is by schools and programs that actually train people to be psychotherapists. They don't. There's none of those training programs or academic programs educate or train you how to utilize astrology as a diagnostic or prognostic tool, and so on, as I was saying before. The two fields are parallel, but they're not officially or formally integrated.
Okay, I've got that. We're going to take a very brief break here to acknowledge the underwriters that make programming like On the Mark possible here on Westfield Community Programming, Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. Our guest this half hour is Glenn Perry. And if you want to learn more about what he's up to, you can check out his website while we take this break. It's aaperry.com. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Underwriting for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Westfield, serving the youth of the Whip City and surrounding communities since 1969. For more information on the Great Futures Club for ages 3 to 5, happening weekdays, and the Club Teen Center for ages 11 and older, weekdays from 6:30 till 8 p.m., go online at bcgwestfield.org or visit the club at 28 West Silver Street. The Boys and Girls Club of Greater Westfield. Great futures start here. Underwriting support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Greater Westfield Chamber of Commerce, the voice of business for the Greater Westfield communities. Informing, educating, advocating, the Chamber provides opportunities for members to make meaningful connections on local, regional, and state levels. For more information on the Chamber's many events, workshops, and programs, as well as the benefits of membership, visit westfieldbiz.org. The Chamber focuses on the most important economy, yours.
Join me, Tina Gorman, each week from 6 to 8 a.m. for Wake Up Wednesday, when my guests and I discuss health, wellness, and lifestyle reimagined.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles is our chief engineer this morning. We are broadcasting from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy in Westfield. Our guest is the astrologer Glenn Perry. He's been a licensed psychotherapist in private practice for years, and he's the author of 8 books. You can find out more about him at aaperry.com. So, Glenn, you've written 8 books. Are these textbooks and manuals, or are they more books of general interest?
More textbooks. They're really written for the astrological community. And within that, probably more of the sophisticated professional astrologer with a psychological orientation.
Now, you've done a lot of teaching and a lot of guest seminars and programs all over the world. Do other countries have a different viewpoint about astrology than America? Are some more involved with it and more accepting of it than others?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Different countries, have different degrees of acceptance and comfort with it. Although I would say probably astrology in the West, in European and in American countries, although it's extremely popular, there's a lot more critical thinking going on. Whereas in a lot of other countries, like, say, India and I really want to name names here because it's a little politically incorrect, they're actually more receptive and open to astrology because the tradition of those countries is less rigidly scientific in a Western way. And so they don't experience the same clash of paradigms and tension between the competing worldviews that exist if you look at like a mechanistic, materialistic worldview that comes out of modern science, and then you look at the old organic paradigm, which was very, very different. The universe was conceived as a living being, and everything was connected and it had intelligence and purpose, and it was divinity or some kind of higher consciousness was imminent throughout the world. That worldview, which is interestingly starting to come back increasingly as a consequence of Western science, is much more compatible with astrology, whereas the old mechanistic materialistic worldview that started back in Newton's day is not so much. And that's when astrology and science split, and astrology was driven underground and driven out of the university systems, that it had an honored place right up until the advent of the scientific revolution.
But in some cultures, astrology and the stars have really been influential on the visual arts and the sculptures and the mosaic and things that have been created. So my question is, has it influenced other cultures more than us?
I guess it depends on what you mean by other cultures. And since I'm really most familiar with my own culture, I can't really say too much about it, at least on the artistic end of things. And if you're talking about to what extent has it influenced the worldview of the culture and their understanding of humankind's place in the cosmos, I'm sure it's very different from culture to culture. I really can't speak to it much more than that.
Yeah,
it's sort of outside of my area of specialization.
I understand. If somebody's interested, I mean, most people know their astrological signs because you can find it anywhere from those little supermarket books to menus. If somebody's interested in learning more about who they are based upon their sign, where are some of the places you recommend they look?
Oh, geez, there's just so many, there's a million books out there. I wrote a book called An Introduction to Astropsychology, which is really, in one sense, it's a book for somebody that doesn't really have a background in astrology. Although very quickly it gets into a much more in-depth, psychologically oriented explication of what astrology is and can be. And I think it's a great book for people that are just generally interested in learning about astrology from the ground floor up. There's a lot of other stuff out there that is very shallow and simplistic, which I have a hard time recommending because it's just not my mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a scene in the movie Grey Gardens where little Edie, Miss Edie Beale, was looking through one of the things, and she determined that based on her astrological sign, her next husband should be a Libra. And she was
that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about.
She was getting her facts from the book that, either the back of TV Guide or, stuff like that. But if somebody really does have an interest, for example, they want to read the book that you wrote, how do they get a copy of your book?
Just go to Amazon.com and type in my name and An Introduction to Astropsychology.
Do you have any videos out there, or are you mostly doing books?
Mostly doing books. I've been working on this 2-year master's degree program. At least it was originally a master's degree program. It was actually an accredited 2-year master's degree program at the Graduate Institute of Connecticut from 2009 to 2012. And then for various reasons having to do with the Eastern Association of Schools and Colleges accreditation of that institute, they decided that astrology was too hot to handle. So the entire program was developed, but I then had to shift it over to my own banner under my own label at the Academy of Astropsychology. And I've been working at refining and developing that program ever since. And there's a little bit more that I still have to do before I get into making videos for the general population, which I'll post on YouTube.
So
I'm
when
about a year away from that.
yeah, when you do your counseling right now, or you do your speaking or whatever, because of the pandemic, have you pretty much switched to Zoom for everything, or
Yes, yeah.
can you actually
Do
go
everything on Zoom.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
foresee yourself going out and doing live stuff down the road, maybe in the next 6 months to a year?
No, never.
Okay.
Not in terms of live counseling. I mean, if somebody lives in my neighborhood and they want to come over and have a live session with me, that's fine. But most of my clients are scattered all over the country and even overseas. I've got clients in Australia and China and Europe. So I mean, it's so nice that way because you're not limited to just your local community. I don't have to do any advertising locally. I don't have to go out there and let people know I'm here. I just moved to Florida, by the way. So whereas I had a local reputation in California, and I was in private practice out there for 32 years. I had an office in San Francisco and also in Marin County. And so I had spent a lot of time building that up before the Zoom era kicked in. But now the Zoom is here, and I get to live wherever I want and see as many clients as I want. There's no reason to go back to renting an office space and having people come in for face-to-face sessions.
I think you're lucky because that you get to be wherever you want. Weren't you for
That's right.
a while on the Connecticut River?
I was, yeah. I was there for 13 years, right on the Connecticut River in Haddam Neck.
Right. So how do you like Florida? It's got to be much nicer than Connecticut, especially January, February, and March.
Yeah, well, especially with the weather. Although I loved where I was in Connecticut, it was a little bit isolated because I was out in the country. The river was great, but I kind of missed being around people more. So here, I'm in Vieira, Melbourne, Vieira, on the Space Coast. You know, only like 10 minutes from the beach, and there's a couple of rivers, and I could take my jet ski out, my kayaks, and I live up right on a golf course, and so there's all sorts of interesting bike paths and, of course, golf and tennis. So it's great. I feel like I'm in Club Med.
You're very lucky. We're out of time, Glenn, but I want to, first of all, thank you for joining us today. And second of all, to tell people that if they want to learn more about you and everything, that you have a website, aaperry.com. And I recommend people go there, check out some of your work, some of your writings and all of that. And maybe we can get you back again at some point down the road, kind of an update on what you're doing, because you do so many interesting things.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on, Mark.
It's been
good
a pleasure.
To see you again.
We've been chatting with Glenn Perry, the astrologer and psychotherapist and author and all of that. And that wraps up in another edition of On the Mark here on Westfield Community Programming Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles has been our chief engineer. If you've missed a part of today's program or you want to watch it again, you can find it on YouTube under WSKB Community Radio. We'll catch you next week on another edition of On the Mark next Wednesday. Thanks for joining us.
Stars, I can give you stars, 100 billion stars in the sky. We could watch them flow by. Suns, that's what stars are, suns, with planets by the tons, where there may be two creatures like us, gazing back through a billion stars. Isn't that a thought? That's awesome. Let me give you stars, 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 stars. How'd you like your stars?
Very nice.
How'd you like to rock it around?
With my feet on the ground.
Stars,
stars.
You and me in stars.
Well,
all the while the earth is still spinning, we're spending tonight gazing up at a billion stars.
You just gave me stars, things like this